Good evening, everybody.
Yeah,
Welcome to tonight's lecture. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Tony Harcup, who is going to speak to us on the Leeds Other Paper. Tony's background is in journalism. He started work in the mid-70s at the Leeds Other Paper, and gradually, I think about 10 years or so later, he's moved on to other papers, but gradually he's moved over into the world of academia, where he has specialized in educating journalists, and he's also published quite widely and is the author of the best-selling book Journalism Principles and Practice, which is now in its 4th edition. So I would like to hand over now to Tony.
Thank you very much. When the publishers describe it as a best-selling book, they're thinking in a very small pool. So don't get carried away with that. Yeah. Thank you very much, and I'd really like to thank you all for coming out on a cold, horrible night. And hello to the audience on Zoom, and thank you for tuning in, even if you decided not to come out on the cold night. And thanks ever so much to the Thoresby Society for putting this event on, and for Leeds Library for hosting it. So I'll put up there alternative news and views. So that's really what tonight is about. Leeds Other Paper was all about alternative news and views. And I can recognise some of you as contributors and indeed workers on Leeds Other Paper. More of you as readers of Leeds Other Paper, and maybe there are some here who are neither and don't know anything about it. So hopefully by the end of this evening, you'll know a bit more, and we'll all know a bit more about Leeds Other Paper. I should say at the start that I was not one of the founders of the paper. I was not there at the very beginning. Gordon here was, so maybe he'll tell us something about that before the evening ends. But I was not there at the beginning, but I was there a year, 18 months after the beginning, and was around for a long time, and it felt longer. So what I'm going to talk about is, it's not the history of Leeds Other Paper, it's a history of Leeds Other Paper, a personal history. There were hundreds and hundreds of people involved in the paper in one way or another over the years as contributors of a variety of different things that people would contribute, would bring their skills and their energy to the paper. And everyone's story will be different. So it can't be the story of Leeds Other Paper, it's a story of Leeds Other Paper, but hopefully it will give you a flavour of it. So for the next 50 minutes or so, and then there'll be time for some questions, I'm going to take you back to the world of LOP, which was 1974 to 1994. Why did it die so soon? Many people ask. How did it survive so long? Is probably a better question that many of us who worked on it would probably say. So, Leeds Other Paper. There we go. This is not the first issue of Leeds Other Paper. As you can see, it's number 20, September 1975. But it's the first issue of Leeds Other Paper that I ever saw. I'd just come to Leeds as a student, so I would have been 18. And I went into a newsagent. I know this was the sort of thing students did in the 1970s. They would go into newsagents. Anybody doesn't know what a newsagent is? Shop that sold newspapers. I think that joke actually genuine. One doesn't know what a newspaper is. It's a collection of words put together on a periodic basis. And Leeds Other Paper was a newspaper, and it was for sale in newsagents. Why was it for sale in newsagents? Because there was lots of left-wing papers and underground papers and alternative papers that never went near a newsagent. But the founders of Leeds Other Paper decided they wanted to be a proper paper, a proper local paper. So they put in a huge amount of effort to get a number of newsagents to take it. And in that first issue that I saw, there was a list there of newsagents that would take it to Blurry. Probably hardly any of those newsagents still exist as newsagents. That list would grow over the years. And a lot of effort was taken to getting it all over the city. Obviously, it was quite easy to take the paper to city centre newsagents, but it was cost effective in terms of money. You could walk a delivery round to the newsagents, but the paper was also taken out to everywhere, to Seacroft and across Gates, across Green, and all over the place. And we would deliver it to those newsagents on a sale or return basis, and you'd go and you'd have taken them 6 copies of the paper the week before, and they've sold 2, they give you 4 back, and they give you about 8 pence or something. It doesn't cover the petrol for delivering it there. But it was important to the founders of the paper that it was a proper paper, and proper papers are sold in newsagents. That's why it was there. But even though something is in a newsagent, doesn't mean that everyone recognises it. And I've had people over the years saying, "Oh, Leeds Other Paper, never heard of it." And I know for a fact they used to go into the shop that sold it. But you don't, unless you know it, you don't really recognise it. I did recognise it in my first few days in Leeds because I'd come across an alternative paper in my youth. So I was kind of tuned in to look for it, and I spotted it. And I thought, that's an interesting headline. £10 million damage to Holbeck wicket. At that stage, I didn't know where Holbeck was. And Headingley also hit, damage £5. Now, some of you might recognise what's going on there in that story of September 1975. And if you don't, the name George Davis at the bottom of that front page might ring 1 or 2 bells. There was a massive campaign about a guy called George Davis who was in prison for a robbery, and a robbery that he said he didn't do, and his friends and family said he didn't do. I mean, it turns out he was a bit of a villain, but he probably didn't do this particular robbery. And there was a big campaign to free him, and that campaign came to Leeds just before this issue of the paper came out, when his friends and family cut up the wicket just the night before Test match at Headingley, and actually caused probably a lot more than £5 damage in that there was a cancellation of the match. But what Leeds Other Paper was doing there was taking the damage that had been caused to the community in South Leeds by the motorways coming through that coincidentally had involved the destruction of a community cricket pitch, and making a compare and contrast in a classic alternative newspaper style. It was sort of a bit propagandistic, but it was, reporting the facts as well, but the facts from a particular point of view. So that caught my attention. I thought, I quite like this paper. I'm going to carry on buying that. As you can see from that front page, it says September 75, so it was monthly at the time, and it cost 5 pence. And in the middle column, which will be too blurry for you to read, so I'll read it out, was a statement and variations of this statement. The paper was A4, so here it is. Variations of this statement appeared in the paper throughout its life. The precise wording did vary, but this was the gist. It says, "We publish Leeds Other Paper because we hope people will find it useful and interesting, and because we enjoy doing it. We are not aligned to any particular political party, but try to support groups and individuals struggling to take control over their own lives, whether it's in the factory, the housing estate, or the home. We can't, however, explain all our aims and ideas in a few sentences. The paper itself should give you a better idea of what we're trying to do. If you like the paper and want to make it better, or help us get it out to more people, we'd be pleased to hear from you. Much of our material comes from sympathisers and groups working in various parts of Leeds, and we'd like to get more news that way. We have weekly meetings every Monday evening, and new people are always welcome. You can contact us by writing to, and there's an address there, which is care of Kelso Road. It didn't have its own premises at this particular point, but was just about to. I think Kelso Road, 15 Kelso Road, was a thing called the Futures Centre. I don't know if anyone remembers the Futures Centre. It was a hive of eco-warriors before the term eco-warriors was invented. Or by phoning us up, and probably somebody's home phone number, I suspect, there back in the day. And as I said, that statement of intent and invitation to get involved was in the paper pretty well every edition throughout its 20 years. And it was an invitation that after a while I took up, but we'll come to that. So going back to the very beginning, on the left there is the very first issue of Leeds Other Paper, with its very subtle comments on the big issues of the day. It was launched in January 1974, simultaneously with Edward Heath calling a general election. He didn't call a general election because of that. It was more because of the miners, but it was coincidental. And that is a scarcely recognisable cartoon of Edward Heath on the front there. That was the only broadsheet in the paper's history. Because it was before my time, I don't have an actual copy. I have a photocopy of it. But luckily, the Leeds Local History Library has bound copies of all papers. And you can't quite see at the top there, but next to where it says Leeds Other Paper, which the first issue was 4p, it says Leeds Libertarian Socialist Newspaper. It was the only time it ever called itself that. It was kind of where the politics were coming from many of the founders. It's more anarchist. And that's at a time when libertarian was generally a left-wing thing. I know it's a contested term these days, and all sorts of people claim to be libertarians, which seems to mean to them that, you know, they can do what they want. But it's not quite as simple as that. But this was, as I say, the first and only broadsheet or A3 size paper in its history. And it was the only one that was quite as overtly propagandistic, really. It was an intervention in what was going on at the time, which was the struggle really between the miners in particular and the working class in general, and the Heath government and its state of emergency that was going on in 74. That didn't turn out too well for Edward Heath. The middle one, that's number 3, Leeds Other Paper number 3, it's changed quite a bit. It's got into its proper reporting, the community reporting. And by number 5 on the right here, more community reporting. This is set the tone for the sort of the template that the paper would follow. I mean, it looks a bit of a mess, frankly. It's a jumble of letter set of varying fonts and probably just a normal typewriter, not even the glorified golf ball typewriters that we developed into. Interestingly, the nice book about the alternative press by Nigel Fountain came out a few years ago. He describes the golf ball typewriter as the Kalashnikov of the guerrilla journalist. It's a very romantic image, but that's an aside. But so these were the early papers, numbers 1, numbers 3, number 5, setting the template. So as I say, I got involved. I took up that invitation to become one of the members of the team, if you like, that was helping to produce it. But I didn't know much or anything. I've not done journalism before, done little bits of writing or whatever. What was I letting myself in for? And at that time, it was a real community effort. It was a big community around the paper. So it'd been going a year or two before I went along, probably 2 years before I ever ventured across the threshold, by which time it had premises in Blenheim Terrace opposite Leeds University. And we would have, by this time it had moved from monthly to fortnightly, and we would have fortnightly editorial meetings. So one Monday there'd be a business meeting. I'm not sure I'll bother going to them. The next Monday there'd be an editorial meeting. And in those days, it's long before any sort of computers and typesetting and everything. So everything anybody had that they'd written for the paper that they wanted to contribute was typed on paper, preferably with carbon, so you had more than one copy. We didn't have a photocopy or anything like that. I think photocopies, if they'd been invented, they were only in sort of the military elites or something had them. We didn't have one. So carbon copies, and there'd be a box of paper articles that would be passed round for about an hour and a half on a Monday evening, and we'd read as many as we could and make little notes on them. And then somebody would say, right, I'm off to the offie, and they would take our orders for the offie, and they'd come back with a load of beer and cider and what have you. And we would consume that and discuss all the articles that we had read, every single article, every single word of every article. And I found that the most fantastic education into journalism. Now, I never went on a journalism training course. I've taught on lots of journalism training courses for a couple of decades. And I've written books about journalism training. I never went on a journalism training course, except I did. It was called Leeds Other Paper editorial meeting, because they were fantastic. They were fantastic education, because there were your readership reading your articles in draft form, saying, what are you going on about? What's this mean? What's this sentence mean? Why have you quoted that person? Why haven't you spoken to this person? What's the point of this story? Why are you even suggesting it? Why aren't we doing this? All those sorts of political questions, as well as journalistic questions. The intro is boring, you know, the main story is buried here, turn it round, and all the tedious stuff like spelling and grammar and punctuation, you know, that will be all pointed out as well. So it was a fantastic education, and it was being done on the job in practice, not just by the small group of founders of the paper, but by a growing number of people who were attracted to it by the kind of blurb that was in that edition that I read out. So that was what was attractive, I think, to me about it, that it was open and it was an education. And, you know, we got the paper out. As I say, that's when it was fortnightly. I happen to think fortnightly is a fantastic frequency for a publication. There's very, very, very few fortnightly publications. Private Eye is the shining example of a successful publication that started in the 60s, early 60s, still going strong. And I think that fortnightly cycle gives you room to breathe, if you like. So it's not all mad production to get the thing out. And in our case, with a very small number of people actually doing the writing of the serious news stories, it gave us time to research those stories. You know, we weren't just having to churn stuff out, if you like. So that was the sort of paper I got involved with. This is the sort of paper that was at the beginning. But like everything else, things don't come from nowhere. Leeds Other Paper had a prehistory. That prehistory was a paper called The Other Paper. The Other Paper existed only for a few months, 1969 to 1970, not the whole of those years. I've looked up the copies in the local history library, which are these from 1969 and 70. As you can see, it actually looks a bit better than Leeds Other Paper does a few years later. It's a bit smarter. It's a bit swisher. That's because the people involved in it took it to commercial designers and commercial printers. And, you know, probably as a result of that, they ran out of money. And it didn't last very long. But it lived on as the way that many alternative papers do, in a kind of collective memory. There was a knowledge of it that I think was there when a few years later people decided we need another alternative paper in Leeds. Interestingly, that front page, Dead End Street for Lower Pay, and that is illustrated with a street sign called Prosperity Street, which was a real street. And I tried to find it, and I went through the old maps to try and find out where it was. It was in, it no longer exists, but it was in the sort of roughly the area where Woodhouse meets Little London. I think it's more or less where a medical centre where some of us have gone and got our COVID jabs. That's pretty much Prosperity Street. But you can see the sort of I suppose the dark humour stroke comment that they were making by talking about people's lower pay, concern for pay, lower rates of pay in 1969 there, illustrating it with a street sign in Leeds called Prosperity Street, which if you've ever seen the fuller photographs of that street, you would know it was a very ironic street name. So that was part of the prehistory. But there was also more prehistory in the sense of the old Northern Star. It used to be a Chartist newspaper published in Leeds, but there was also a flowering of alternative publications in the years just before Leeds Other Paper was launched and around the same time. And there's a project called the Recovering the Regional Radical Press in Britain project, that Julie here and myself and Keith Lomax and Max Farrer from Leeds were all at a few years ago. I can't remember exactly when. It was BC. It was before COVID. It was sometime before that. In Bristol, we gathered, and some people say I talk out the back of my head, but Max spotted as we were having our lunch. He said, "These are the papers on the back of your head," and he had to take this picture. So this is the one occasion that it might be relevant to use that picture of Leeds Other Paper. It looks like it's a tattoo. Maybe I should get a tattoo. Anyway, the good thing is that project, and there's the website for it at the bottom of the screen. That project is gathering, or has been gathering, information about some of the range of radical and alternative papers that were around in the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s, into the 80s. And it's a kind of a project of oral history. I don't know how much it's gathering new material now, or maybe they've run out of funding, but the website is there with a number of interesting pieces written by people who were contributors to some of those papers. So they were springing up all over the place. That was part of the context in which Leeds Other Paper existed. There were community papers as well. In Leeds, Chapeltown News actually predates Leeds Other Paper by a year or two. And I was noticing that headline. I don't know if anyone's tried to read that headline on Chapeltown News. It seems like they've thrown up a bunch of words in the air, and Chapeltown News could more or less have those words in any combination as their headline in any issue. But racist attacks, official control, police pressure. I mean, I'm not. Anyway, a kind of you know what I mean. But that was, very much a Chapeltown paper. A little bit Hare Hills, but mainly Chapeltown. Yapstick was a Woodhouse paper. Very much a Woodhouse paper. Not anywhere. Not Little London. Not Hyde Park. Woodhouse. And there were loads of those little community papers, many of them not as political as Leeds Other Paper. I mean, Chapeltown News was a very campaigning paper. Most of them were just, local, what today we would call hyper-local. But they existed in print. So there was this urge to get into print that was being felt. And Leeds was not special in this. I mean, we felt we were special, but we weren't. It was happening all over the place. One place it happened was New York a few years earlier. So it was actually a guy from Sheffield who was involved. He was a journalist on the Village Voice, a kind of quite well-established alternative publication, if that's not an oxymoron, which it probably is. And he fell out with them a bit. So he was involved in producing an alternative to the alternative, which he called the East Village Other. So that came out in about 1968, 69. So, and I think some of the people involved in the original Other Paper, the 1969 Other Paper in Leeds, were aware of this kind of flowering of the underground press in the States. I think that's a cartoon by Robert Crumb on the front. So, I mean, very different from Leeds Other Paper. I mean, more of the druggy kind of underground hippie-ish culture. Not to stereotype it too much, but yes, to stereotype it. More that kind of thing. Quite different from headlines about motorways in Holbeck and Hunslet and all that. But in some ways, they were coming from a similar place, dissatisfaction with mainstream publications. And somewhere else where the urge to get into print had happened a year or two before Leeds Other Paper came on the scene was in Liverpool. And the Liverpool Free Press, which was a really strongly campaigning but journalistic publication. Unlike LOP, Liverpool Free Press was founded in part by some journalists who worked on the local mainstream papers, who were fed up with, they couldn't get the stories in that they were interested in. So they produced their own outlet and other people got involved. So the Liverpool Free Press has now been archived by one of the journalists, Brian Whittaker, one of those involved on it. So I've put the address there. He's digitized every issue of the Liverpool Free Press. He has the advantage compared to LOP. They didn't last many years, so it's not as many issues. But it's a fantastic resource, and you can go and have a look at those. And a few years ago, Brian Whittaker wrote an interesting book called News Limited, Why You Can't Read All About It, which I used to recommend to my students. I used to run a module called Alternative Media at University of Sheffield. How many of them ever read this book? I don't know. But I used to point them in the direction of his writings, because it was something quite similar to what we were doing. And there's just one little passage I thought I'd read out to you. He's talking about Liverpool Free Press. The free press style of journalism was a far cry from the objectivity of the established press. We did not pretend to be neutral or objective. The paper aimed to be involved in issues and struggles, and it readily took sides. But there was nothing dishonest about that. We did not twist the facts, we interpreted them. What we presented was the truth as we saw it after examining the available facts. So it was reporting that was based on the facts, it was based on evidence. And I often say one of the best things that Leeds Other Paper ever did was to keep out the stories that you'd have never read in it. Because all sorts of weird and wonderful people would come and tell us about conspiracies and all sorts of things. I mean, we were, especially when we had a city centre office, people would wander in off the streets and tell you about the chief constables doing this and, the judges are doing this. We never printed a word of it. We would sometimes try and investigate, and if you can't find it, you didn't, so we were not, the equivalent of Elon Musk's X, anything goes. We did journalism, we did reporting. But if we got stuck into a story and we found, there is something going on here, then we would look for the evidence, we would find the evidence, and we would not be afraid of publishing the evidence. So it's not about twisting facts, but nor is it pretending, if there's a battle between the miners and the government, that we're here looking at, on the one hand this, on the other hand that. No, we're reporting it from the ground up, because they were not getting a fair hearing in the mainstream media. So people sometimes say, what were you an alternative to? And it was an alternative to the right-wing ethos of the mainstream media. It's hard, unless you go back in the archives, it's hard to understand quite how conservative, with both big and small c, a lot of the mainstream media was, certainly in the 70s and 70s and 80s. And I mean, this city was a monopoly city in terms of print publications. It was the Yorkshire Post, Yorkshire Evening Post, and then they launched the Leeds Weekly News, which was a proper newspaper for a while, for a good few years. All published by a company that until the late 60s had been called Yorkshire Conservative Newspapers Limited. Then they changed the name. What else they changed? Not so much. Now, in those days, when LOP was started, they were fantastically resourced newspapers. I mean, they'd sell a couple of 100,000 a day of the Evening Post. There was 6 or 7 editions coming out all the time. And they had so many journalists, I was about to say ridiculous number of journalists. As a good member of the NUJ, I can't say that. They were adequately staffed. They were adequately staffed, certainly compared to now. But they tended to have a conservative mindset, or at least that was the kind of stuff that dominated in the headline. So although their coverage of sport and their TV listings and, the weather, snow comes to Leeds and all that will be fantastic. There's no way we could compete with anything like that. But, and their court coverage, the cases in the courts and stuff, we couldn't compete with any of that. But when it came to politics, when it came to council issues, they were obsessed with the rate, whether this service was going to put a penny on the rate and that kind of thing. Whereas we would see council stories to do with both the council workers and, even more importantly, members of the community, and these citizens, people who are service users. That's what council stories were about for us, not about a penny on the rate. So there was a real clash of viewpoints, and for all their, their ability to staff and go and cover all sorts of meetings and everything else, we found them often missing the story. They weren't interested really in those community stories. They did get a bit better, and there were some heroic exceptions on the staff, but they missed a lot of stories. And there's the most atrocious sexism, also racism, but more noticeable was the most atrocious sexism. It was a daily occurrence in those publications, and the women working on those publications, who sometimes consciously fought against that, were in given a hard time. I know from experience. So that's why so many people were saying, we need some kind of alternative to this, and that's where we came in, and we discussed the kind of stories that we should be doing. And I think it was Gordon here who wrote this document, one of our internal discussion documents, which we would have, that rather marked us out as slightly different from the Evening Post, Yorkshire Post. I don't think they had internal discussion documents to discuss the nature of news, but we did on occasions. Not going to spend all that much time doing it, but we did. And this, I think, this quote encapsulates it quite well, that a good story is one that reinforces the ability of the mass of people to do things for themselves and decreases their reliance on others. You remember that early blurb that I read out about what Leeds Other Paper exists for, to support people in struggle, whether it be in the home or the community or the factory or the estate or whatever. It's the people at the bottom of the pile that we are interested in reporting their point of view, but particularly those who are at the bottom of the pile but are doing something about it. Active citizens, we might think of it as. That's what the paper exists for. So, there's a tenants group formed in Cross Gates. That's if it's not really going to be noticed by the Yorkshire Evening Post unless they do something outrageous. Whereas we were all over it. We want to hear from these people. Why? What are your concerns? What are your issues? That was gold dust to us. That's what we wanted. Even if we hardly sold any copies of the paper in Crossgates, and we might sell 3 or 4 more after that kind of front page story, because we weren't doing it to try and have a money making operation. Right. So these extracts here give you a sense of some of those people in struggle that we were reporting on. In the middle there, the Bradford 12, people might remember the Bradford 12 trial, 12 lads in Bradford who were arrested, and the trial became a big cause célèbre over the issue of self-defense of the Asian community against what I felt were going to be an attack by fascists coming into their area in Bradford. Big story for us. It would have been a bit of a story even if it had been happening only in Bradford, but it became a big story for us when their trial was moved to Leeds Crown Court and took place over a number of weeks. And they were acquitted, hence the front page jubilation. And it's interesting, if you hang around long enough, you become history, and people are interested in interviewing you and looking at things that you were involved with. So, but over the last year, there's been a TV series, I think it was called Defiance, about the Asian experience in the UK. They used some of the Leeds Other Paper's coverage of the Bradford 12 trial and some of the headlines to give them some graphics and context for what was going on at the time. And there's another film specifically about the Bradford 12 that has used LOP headlines and has looked at that. So it's a great resource there that is being used. On the right-hand side, coverage of the miners' strike. I mean, if you were interested in researching the miners' strike, the 84-85 miners' strike in Yorkshire, then, you know, you couldn't do any better than going back through the weekly copies of Leeds Other Paper. It was extraordinary reporting on the ground. I mean, Gordon there did a lot of the reporting on the picket lines. Julie wrote that article, I think, about the women involved in the strike. All sorts of reportage was going on. That's not all we did. We had I remember now, we were in Cookeridge Street then, and at the top of the big flight of stairs in what is it now? I was going to say the town and country. It's the O2 Academy or something, isn't it? We had an office in there, and at the top of the big flight of stairs, we had a cardboard box where people could donate food, and then every week or whenever it was full, we'd take it off to the miners, and we would publish a thing called Big Line. You can just see mention of Big Line there in that article, which was Leeds Trades Council's offering to support the miners by people could appeal. So, you know, this couple in Pontefract just had a baby, they need a cot, or they haven't got a cot, phone this number, or so-and-so is offering a pram or pushchair or whatever. All that kind of stuff was going on. Community effort to support the miners. And our coverage of it was real nitty-gritty. And it was really interesting if you look back at that, because there's obviously been documentaries quite a lot recently about the miners' strike because of anniversaries and things, and journalists love anniversaries. And, you know, it's been presented very much as this big battle of armies and generals and Scargill and Thatcher. And, you know, on the ground, it really wasn't that. You know, it was about young people, and in some cases older people, but mainly younger people getting out there fighting for what they believed in. It was their strike. It wasn't Scargill's strike. It was their battle. And that's how we reported, not as Scargill's battle. He was scarcely mentioned in a whole year of coverage at OOP. And what I think we were really good at, without blowing our trumpet too much, was bringing all these things together. So we weren't a trade union publication that only covered this. You know, we weren't an anti-racist publication that only covered those stories. We weren't a cultural publication that only covered the art. We did all those things. So people would look at the paper for all sorts of different things, but you'd absorb, you know, in the sort of serendipity, you'd absorb some of this information about campaigns that you didn't know you were interested in, you didn't know anything about, but you'd kind of now be aware of, and oh yeah, they're collecting for the miners or whatever. And an example of that, where it was non-specialist but brought things together, is top left-hand corner there, which is from an edition of the paper in 1977. And it's reporting on what I'm pretty certain was the first Reclaim the Night March in the UK. And there's some arguments it was the first Reclaim the Night March in Europe. And it's a photograph, bit blurry, but quite atmospheric, of some women marching along with torches, I think, or certainly flares, or whatever. Probably didn't even have flares in those days, other than trousers, but torchlit procession anyway. And we were probably the first to cover it. I don't know, I'm not going to make that big claim, but I don't think the Evening Post were interested. I don't think the Evening Post were interested in those days. So I'm just going to read out that little story, because it says something about some of the tone of the sort of things that we would publish. So, women reclaim the night. How often have you been harassed on the streets, winked at, had your bottom pinched, been insulted, been followed? Have you or any women you know been assaulted, attacked, raped? Women are daily and nightly subjected to the violence of men in their homes, workplaces, and on the streets. Rather than run away and hide from this violence, women in Leeds took to the streets to reclaim a cold, wet November night. Wet November night. We don't have them anymore. On November the 12th, we walked, sang, and shouted our way from Hyde Park and Chapeltown to City Square, where we all formed a big circle and danced by torchlight. Further action around the rape issue is being planned, possibly including the local rape counselling service. Watch LOP for details. This was 1977, really early for a lot of this stuff. LOP was there. Now, I suspect it wasn't a member of our staff if we didn't even have hardly any staff. I think Peter was the only member of staff in 1977. I suspect it wasn't a member of staff who wrote those words. It would have been given to us probably by some of the organisers along with the photograph, because we were the natural place to report that, and we were coming out at that time fortnightly. It'd be a quick way of getting the word out. This was at a time in the context of the Peter Sutcliffe killings that was going on, at a time when the police were warning women not to go out. It was dangerous, women should stay at home. Whereas a lot of women were saying, well, hang on, we're not causing the problem here, it's men who are causing the problem. If anyone should stay at home, it should be men. Hence the article at the bottom there about the curfew, and some women's groups asking, I mean, rhetorically rather than practically, that there should be a curfew on men rather than a curfew on women. So that's the kind of issue that LOP was there to cover. So quite different from the miners' strike, quite different from the motorway go through things, all linked by this theme that it was people standing up for themselves, doing something about it. Another issue that LOP was big on was the environment. Again, quite early when a lot of the left not that interested in the environment issues. So we were very interested in particular in the fact that there were regular trains coming through Leeds carrying both nuclear waste and nuclear weapons. And we were involved and supportive of some of the campaigns who were drawing attention to this, what we felt was a dangerous business, carrying nuclear stuff through a very built up area. And the paper developed quite good relations with some of the campaigners. And we would get tip-offs. There's a train coming through. And on this particular day, this is 1981, in the office, we got a phone call to say there's a train coming through in about 20 minutes, half an hour, whatever. And it was Keith Lomax, I think, who took the call. Certainly, it was Keith who leapt into action, as Keith would. And there was no car in the office. There weren't many cars. There were no staff cars. Okay, some members of staff had cars. Sometimes they had them. Sometimes they didn't. There was no car in the office. But he was told this train was passing through Holbeck. So he grabbed the camera and ran to Holbeck. And he ran to Holbeck and got there in time to take a picture of this train, which we think, or at the time, we thought was actually carrying a nuclear weapon rather than nuclear waste. And it was helped in his photography by the fact that this train carrying this deadly cargo was stuck at the signals for about 20 minutes. It was held up. So he carried on taking pictures of it, and then was spotted by the police who were guarding it. And they started to chase him. And when this other paper, when it died, I did a little pamphlet and did a few interviews with people. And one of the people I interviewed was Keith. And he described this. He says, I was running with the police chasing after me. And as I ran, I wound the film back. Remember film in cameras? He's running, he's winding the film back. So as I'm running, I wound the film back so that I could hide it before they got me. So he was going to hide it in the bushes and go back for it later. But actually, he outran them. What a fit young man he was. So that was Keith Lomax. And that get up and go spirit that Keith displayed there, I think, was kind of the spirit of LOP throughout its life, really. Possibly not towards the end, but throughout most of its life. Sadly, we lost Keith this summer, but I would. He taught me an awful lot about journalism, and I tip my hat to Keith. He could teach everyone a lot of things, including energy and indeed running. So the environment, nuclear issues, we were on it, but we were also on the little stories about the little people, if you like. That sounds very patronizing, but everyday people who weren't involved in massive campaigns, didn't have big organizations behind them. Two little examples here. I think I can remember going to that house for the top story. This baby died, and not long after, the family had had their electricity cut off, and they felt the electricity board were to blame. And it was a tragic, horrible story. And the one at the bottom there, which I think was one of Gordon's stories, about a woman called Rose Towlerton, who'd worked in a factory and had terrible nickel poisoning. It was really ruining her life, and she was wanting to get at least some recompense, and more than just some compensation. She wanted to get her voice out there, and that's what LOP was there for, as well as the big campaigns. It was people's voices of people who felt they'd been done down, and indeed, in many cases, they were being done down. So I think those are good examples of those. Another example here, not the Scott Hall Middle School story, although that's a classic campaign to save a school. Didn't save it, it's closed. But anyway, but the story at the top, My Heart Was Broken. That's a story that I remember doing now. I didn't have a lot of memories about it, but in preparation for this talk, I was digging through some old files, and I came across handwritten letter. You might remember handwritten letters. I came across a handwritten letter to me by the woman at the heart of that story in 1986. It says, "Dear Tony, thank you for your paper and thank you for your very good story. For me, it was very good and interesting reading, and thankful to say that every word was true." And what the story was, it was about the Leeds Club, which is, I can't quite work out the geography, but it's about 20 yards across the back way there. It's no longer run by the same people. It's no longer the gentleman's club that it was for 100 odd years. But cut a long story short, she was she worked as a manageress at the Leeds Club, and then they brought in, so she was running it pretty much, but then they brought in a man over her, installed him as manager, and more or less downgraded her to a glorified cleaner, even though she had to show him what the job entailed and to do everything. So she walked out and tried to take them she took them to an industrial tribunal. They're now called employment tribunals, I think, but it was an industrial tribunal then, for constructive dismissal and sex discrimination. Now, it's quite an interesting story for a number of reasons. One is that we used to get lists of cases at industrial tribunals, and just as any news organisation has a sense of what we think of as news values, this might make a story, this won't. We were looking, and all we had was the name of the employer. So some firms, would always be interested. If somebody was taking a tribunal against Yorkshire Post newspapers, we're going to be interested, whatever it is. Okay. So some firms, so we were interested in the Leeds Club because it's a posh club. Okay, so we were interested in it. But it also listed what act. So because it was sex discrimination, then it's telling you, oh yeah, that might be an interesting story. So just as the Evening Post or the Yorkshire Post or BBC or anyone else, they have their sense of news values, little things that will go, oh yeah, that might make something interesting. So did we, but they were often different ones. And a posh club being accused of sex discrimination, that ticked the box for us. It's worth spending a few hours in an industrial tribunal, which is what I did, and covered her story. But it was just one of hundreds and hundreds of stories that I covered, so I hadn't got any great memory of it until I found her letter and then went back and dug it up. And that's the inside one on the left there, with a cartoon by Janice Goodman, actually, at the bottom there, so reproduced a bit little. And that gave all the evidence. And then they deferred the decision. A few weeks later, she lost their case, and that's their coverage. Something else Leeds Other Paper was very good at was sticking with stories. We would go back to stories. We would do follow-ups, proper follow-ups, not just one little paragraph, giving the verdict, but going into it in detail. So an example of giving somebody's point of view, giving them a voice. They felt they were being done down. They pretty much were being done down. At least they had a voice with us. And at the end of her letter, she says, "I'm sorry to say, having mentioned your paper to various people, they haven't heard of it. Now, that is the tragedy of Leeds Other Paper as well. We did a good job. She felt better. She got her voice out there, but not enough people were going to read it. And that was perennially the problem. We only used to sell mostly about 2,500 copies, something like that. I know the Evening Post's print circulation is almost down as low as that now. And pretty soon it will be below it. It's below 5,000 print. But you know, occasionally we sold maybe 3 or 4 at the highest and maybe 1,500 at the lowest, something like that. That was broadly what we were selling. But of course, you know, people passed it on, and more people than that read it occasionally. And so, you know, word got out. It did a good job, even if your stories were not read by that many people immediately. And I know that it meant a lot to the people at the heart of those stories, because when I was a freelance journalist later, I went on a totally different story to visit Rose Towlerton, who Gordon had written about her nickel poisoning, and to try and explain her case. This was several years later. She got out a scrapbook, and there were the cuttings from Leeds Other Paper, including the cutting that I just showed you. So it means a lot to people to have their story validated. I know we lost a bit of time because of the technical issues, so I'll speed up to get towards the end here. But it wasn't all news, and it wasn't all doom and gloom. It was culture. It was art. It was, in some cases, rugby league. We had the most extraordinary rugby league column, Louis Kazatkin, who was known as the man in the stand, who wrote weird columns about rugby league. He had a language all of his own, and the rugby league competitions were often sponsored by tobacco companies. There was the John Player Cup, which he would refer to in copy as the Nicotine Mucus Trophy. And it was a style all of its own. And this middle page, this is a classic example of a page from our What's On guide. Actually, March 1984, so the first month, coincidentally, of the miners' strike. What's going on there? You've got half a page of rugby league. You've got Leeds Trades Council Arts Committee putting on an anti-macho cabaret, whatever that is, or anti-macho or macho, you choose. We've got a Divine Siren Theatre Company benefit for the lesbian line. We've got Morris dancing at the Grove. We've got Snape Davis and his alligator shoes performing at the Bradford International Jazz Festival. And if that's not enough excitement, we've got a Reichian therapy weekend. From rugby league to Reichian therapy, all human life is there. And that's what LOP did. It brought together a lot of that stuff. So right from the beginning, there was rudimentary listings. But in 1977, I think it was, we started a full-on What's On guide. And eventually, the What's On guide rather took over the paper right at the very end. But mostly there was a better balance, if you like. And, you know, there were listings of theatres and gigs and cinemas and all sorts of things and meetings. There were a lot more kind of meetings and events there. And again, it was somewhere, I mean, years before the internet, you know, it brought together this sort of information. You could find out what was going on. The bottom left there was our attempt to produce a sort of punk fanzine style page to give us to get us up to date in 1977 with mixed results. But eventually, as I say, the What's On became more a bigger part of the paper. And we would always discuss, are people buying the paper for the news or for the entertainment and the What's On? And, you know, the reality is most of them weren't buying it at all, not enough of them. But in a quest for more readers, we briefly changed the name to Leeds and Bradford Other Paper. There's a, you know, if you go back to the archive, you'll see a few called Leeds and Bradford Other Paper. And for the last few years, we changed the name to the Northern Star, partly as a I say we, I was no longer on the staff then, but I was sort of around the edges. And the name change was a little bit in homage to the Chartist newspaper of the same name, but mainly to drop the Leeds tag, and the Leeds Other Paper was always a bit of a mouthful to say to people on the phone, you know, you are the other bit. So we changed the name to Northern Star in the quest to sell more copies outside Leeds and the rest of the north. Never didn't really work. If anything, sold fewer copies. But it did gradually look a bit smarter. And although it became more of a what's on guide, it still had something of an edge there, as you can see with the, probably can't quite read that. It says heterosexuality, can it be cured? What causes it? It's a little humour going in there. But it was not enough. Not enough people ever bought it. And for many years, many of those 20 years, there was a big enough pool of us around the paper to keep it going with fundraising schemes and all sorts of things. But by the end, the core group had grown smaller and smaller, more and more worn out. And when they ended up with just not enough money to pay the bill for the next delivery of paper, to print the paper on, they just, without warning, the people who were left there suddenly said, bugger it, or words to that effect, we're not going on anymore. So they produced, with gallows humour, what they called the collector's issue, the last issue, January 1994, almost to the day, 20 years after the first issue had come out. And see, by this time, the last issue cost 60p, the first issue cost 40p. That's inflation. They might talk about inflation now, but that's inflation. 4p to 60p. Yeah, sorry, not 40p, 4p to 60p. So it died without warning, and it's gone. And I keep reading these letters out, but another letter that I found recently was a letter from the aforementioned man in the stand, Louis Kazatkin, who, when he came across my pamphlet a few months later, wrote to me and said, amongst other things, he said, given that financial Armageddon was probably inevitable, the only lingering shame is that LOP didn't die with its boots on. Rather, it slipped into a coma whilst trying on some carpet slipper name change. So that was Louis' point of view on the Northern Star. Other views are available, but it was probably, 20 years. It wasn't a bad innings anyway. It outlived the original. The Chartist Northern Star didn't last that long. Liverpool Free Press only lasted a couple of years. Most of the alternative papers were a lot less long-lasting than LOP, so it didn't do bad. What is its legacy? It's part of the collective memory, collective history of Leeds, if you like. Increasingly, it is being referred to by researchers researching that period, whether it's the period to do with the Ripper murders, whether it's the miners' strike, whether it's Bradford 12, whether it's community stuff. I've been interviewed by all sorts of people doing PhDs on everything from geography and housing issues to environmental issues, all sorts of stuff. Suddenly they're interested in people of, you were alive then in the 70s. Ooh, what was it like? So you live long enough, you become history. So as to what its legacy is, it's probably too early to say. But as again from the pamphlet there, which I'm pleased to say there is a copy, probably only one, but a copy held in the Leeds Library of this pamphlet that came out in 1994 called The Northern Star. And as Julie here quoted us in that pamphlet, said it was only a grotty little thing produced on a few sheets of recycled paper that 2,000 people would buy. But that doesn't measure up to the impact it had over the years. It had a profound effect on Leeds in its small way. And I think that's true. A profound effect on the city because it was there as a resource. It was an alternative to the monopoly of the Yorkshire Post, Yorkshire Evening Post. And even though, it didn't shake the foundations of the city, the fact that it gave people a voice, and particularly gave a voice to the people actively involved in struggle, God, how we could do with that now. There are many, many, many alternative type of things out there. There's the West Leeds Dispatch, there's the South Leeds Life, there's East Side Story. There's all sorts of things out there. And there's some newsletters in different cities, Sheffield and Manchester and Liverpool. And now Teesside have got these subscription newsletters doing some good local news. There's the Bristol Cable down in Bristol, which is the most successful of the alternative papers, I think, local ones currently. So there are things going on, but certainly in this city, there's nothing that has that sort of umbrella, that overview of cultural and political and active things with an interest in the community. So yeah, we kind of we miss it. But maybe one day it will get a pink plaque or a blue plaque, because next weekend the Chartist Northern Star is getting its very own blue plaque in this city, off Briggate, next to, I was going to say next to Greg's, but that doesn't narrow it down very much, does it? It's probably about 30 different places. Central Arcade, where the Northern Star used to be based, when it was printed in Leeds in the 19th century, when it was one of the biggest selling newspapers in the world, if not the biggest selling. And we outlasted it, LOP outlasted it. So, you know, but it's taken a long time for the Northern Star to get its plaque. So maybe one day LOP will get a plaque. I think I've said enough, and be open to questions. Are you going to take charge? You want the microphone?
There you go.
I can't take that.
Thank you, Tony, for that really interesting trip down memory lane, which I'm sure we've all enjoyed. Before I throw this open to the floor for questions, can I just remind everyone that we do have a lot of people watching on Zoom, so any questions in the room, try and keep them short and succinct, so that I can, because the people on Zoom won't be able to hear, and I will repeat them for their benefit. So do we have any Michael? Yes.
Just 2 points. One is that Johnny didn't go around to mentioning the fact that the Leeds City Council wouldn't accredit Leeds Other Paper, even though the journalists were in the union and so on. And they just felt with the Labour Party, which was bizarre. And what the journalists would do, they'd come and I would slip them the agendas under the table, in effect. And so they had all the material. But one of the, I think one of the newer ones came into the committee meeting and said, "Have you got the agendas for Leeds Other Paper?" So they gave the game away, but that continued for quite a while. But they did eventually have to recognise the Leeds Other Paper and give them the rights. The other thing is that Gordon one time picked up a local scandal about the proposed arts centre, what became the Third Whitecloth Hall. And the problem was in giving all the material to Gordon to run it, because it was a bit of scoop for LOP, was that one of the 3 trustees was a very respected Leeds solicitor who was terrified that if the thing failed, 3 trustees, me, her, and the third person, would go down for about 40,000 quid. And so we couldn't deal with it until we got the out of the way and we were safe. And Gordon and I had to do a deal. And eventually, the deal was that they got the scoop when it became, and it was a good story, which ran in a big way. So that I thought was a very good thing. The only other point was that there was a very good cartoon done by a splendid guy called John Quayle. I don't know if he's still around, John, but he is he still? I'm glad, because he wrote the definitive history of the anarchist movement in Britain. And John did this, but it was a very, very good column. He was a very skillful cartoonist, was John.
Yes, thank you, Michael. I mean, they were observations, comments, though, weren't they? Really. I mean, one of the points, Michael, well, he's mentioned lack of accreditation by the council, but one of the points he's raised there was something that I was thinking about, which was whether the paper was ever sued for libel. Which Michael was touched on. Do you want to respond?
Not really.
Respond.
I've forgotten it all. Yeah, thank you. Just on a couple of points. Yeah, Michael was quite right about the council in the early days wouldn't recognise as a proper paper, and it was we had the support of the NUJ, which actually helped change the. I mean, Michael was very helpful in getting us the information in the meantime. But who was a Liberal councillor, if anyone doesn't know. But the NUJ was helpful in getting that policy overturned, and we quickly did then become recognised as a proper newspaper, and we're given all the privileges, whatever those privileges were. This was before freedom of information was a thing, you know, so citizens of Leeds didn't have the right to see agendas of council meetings and things like that. You know, wasn't a thing. It was something that had to be fought for, like anything else of value, really. And we mentioned, well, I mentioned Keith as well. Keith Lomax was the first paid worker at LOP. He got, I think it was £15 a week, raised by, you know, the jumble sales equivalent and the sales from the paper. And as soon as he got that wage, he applied to join the NUJ. And there was some umming and ahhing about some of the more conservative members of the NUJ, you know, like these proper journalists and the rest of it. But once he was allowed in, once he got in, he took on a lot of donkey work in the NUJ and helped get the NUJ support. On the issue of libel, I mean, over the years, there were a number of threats. I mean, we took the line, I think, similar to what Private Eye do in the sense of if people will publish a letter saying this isn't true or write a letter saying this isn't true, we would publish that. If they're threatening you with libel and stuff, we would seek legal advice from friendly people. I mean, the details are lost in the midst of time, and conscious that this call is this meeting is possibly going to be put online and stored in perpetuity, and some people are still alive out there. I don't think any cases came to court cases. We you know, occasional apologies were issued and occasional settlements were reached of small amounts of money, but yeah, is that fair? I know somebody who isn't alive. Should we give him the microphone?
Given that I was
Is that dangerous?
Given that I was often threatened with libel suits, but Tony's quite correct. But one thing he omits to mention was that we actually had a very good supportive solicitor, Cohen, in Park Square, right? And I do remember one occasion, I on the grounds you can't libel the dead, where we had a go at Manny Cousins, if people can remember him, and he'd become chair of Leeds United at one point, and we had a go. And I used to get the Financial Times just really to see what he was up to.
Gordon, he was not dead when that was run. He is now. He was not dead when that was run.
Anyway, sorry about that. He wanted to sue us for libel. We took it to Cohen, and he just looked at it and said, "This isn't libel, it's just vulgar abuse."
Yes, so I'll come over with the mic.
No, I don't think it's mic, it's all right, I've got a loud enough voice.
All right. Well,
It's
for the people on Zoom.
For the viewers,
right on Zoom on here.
for the viewers at home.
I can't believe it, Melbourne. Identified a consistent house style in Leeds Other Paper, and when I contributed to it, nobody told me that there was a house style. And I'm just wondering whether you ever pushed, shall we say, George Orwell's protocols about style. Did you have any opinions on that?
Okay, style. Yeah. Well, there was no consistent house style, but we did have a style guide, didn't we? I think you drafted that.
Yeah, I wrote one.
You did have a,
Nobody took any
no,
notes.
nobody took any notice. No, some people did take notice, but it wasn't a I mean, it wasn't a very restrictive house style. I mean, some publications are very restrictive, but it was you know, it was as much a political house style as anything else. It was about saying the important people in this story are the ordinary people. It's not the councillor, it's not the MP, it's not the judge or whatever. It's the people whose point of view you're writing this story from. They're the important people. So that was, the political style. We did have, a certain style. We had adopted what we would think of in the news stories of, your normal conventions of more active writing, short sentences, never use a foreign word or jargon, never use a long word or jargon where a short one will do, a plain English one. George Orwell's 6 rules of writing stand very well. I don't think I was particularly aware of them at that time. I've subsequently become more aware of them, but they would be more or less the kind of thing that we were encouraging our writers to do. And we do have people coming in saying, oh, I'd like to write it. I mean, in fact, I had an email yesterday from somebody who's now working on a national newspaper who said, oh, I've just been telling my trainee about my origin story at Leeds Other Paper, which is that I came in because I thought it was a good thing, and I offered to, hang around and make the tea. And he said, you sent me out on a story straight away, which is the sort of thing we would do, but we wouldn't then publish that story, unless we knew them and we knew them who they were. We wouldn't publish that story willy-nilly. We'd go through it with them when they came back. If nobody went through your copy or changed it, it's probably because we knew you were a reliable source, probably. But yeah.
Okay. Kevin, yeah.
Yes, my question is really about the importance of physical print news media. I mean, in the days when I was director of Leeds Civic Trust, I had very good contacts with the Yorkshire Evening Post, occasionally Leeds Other Paper. But the point was, you could be confident that if you got something, certainly in the Yorkshire Evening Post or the Yorkshire Post, the councillors would definitely know about it. And in a sense, the decline of the current print media means that what I sort of say, we don't have the village notice board anymore. And obviously the print media, I used to think, well, if I get something in the print media about something, then councillors were frightened because it was permanent. You couldn't get away with it. It was there. And so, and I sort of think that with the social media today, it's difficult to know where to turn to get the overall picture. So given, okay, there were limitations to the Yorkshire Evening Post, shall we say, but you've got pretty much what was going on. You could see that quite broadly. And of course, in the early days, there were proper reports on council meetings, whereas now you just don't get anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good point. And, when I would go to report on council committees, LOP, my LOP hat on, there'd be somebody from the Yorkshire Post who had the full-time council municipal correspondent, and the Evening had a full-time municipal correspondent, and often somebody from Radio Leeds would be at the press bench, and there would be reports. So we weren't there just to report the same old news. We would be looking for an angle, we could choose what ones we went to. But now there's just an absence of that in terms of committees. Some of them are covered, and I don't wish to belittle the efforts of the staff who remain at the mainstream papers, who often making heroic efforts against their own employers in some instances to try and cover the news as best they can. But it's a frightful situation. We've lost that. You mentioned the sort of notice board. I mean, you get the risk of going pretentious. I mean, Jürgen Habermas talks about the media fulfilling a role as a public sphere, a place where people can learn what's going on and discuss it free from the powers that be, if you like. And LOP provided an alternative public sphere, for people who are often alienated by the mainstream media, didn't look at it. A lot of our readers wouldn't read the Evening Post, Yorkshire Post. Didn't feel themselves represented in those pages, but did to an extent feel themselves represented in LOP. Didn't mean that they always felt we got it right and they didn't complain about things. They did. They would let us know, and we would often respond and sometimes say, actually, you're right. We were wrong about that. But we were that space, that alternative public sphere. And just, that page that had the Viking therapy and everything else that was going on. It was just a space you could find that kind of stuff out. And we were big representative, if you like, of or mouthpiece for the cooperative movement in the city, which is a big, big city, lots of workers' co-ops, of which we were a workers co-op. Yeah. So yeah, if LOP was formed now, it would be very different from what it was. So the existing publications are very different from what LOP was, but so would LOP if it was formed now. Just as LOP in 1984 was different from 1974. So different publication reflects the time.
Yeah. Another question here.
Yeah. You talked about how clear the approach of we as the paper deciding what stories to talk about and how you were going to talk about them. And over 20 years, I just wondered how you managed to continue getting along and working together, and if there were like any memorable moments of dispute about should we write about this, and because obviously there's also going to be lots of very independent thinkers, so just how the clarity of this is how we're going to do things was maintained over such a long period of time with so many different people coming and being involved at different stages.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question.
Yeah, there's a row every four.
I mean, it existed. I mean, kind of everything was being talked about all the time about things, but it wasn't all. It wasn't like we were all there as representatives of a particular political line and saying, this is the line we have to take, and this is. I mean, disagreements and arguments were just as likely to be about should we have television listings in the What's On guide, or is that a waste of time? There was a discussion about that, probably an ongoing discussion. Is that a waste of two pages, which some people would argue, because you can get TV listings everywhere else, and we weren't particularly doing anything different with them, with one exception, which I might mention in a second. But other people were saying, well, yeah, but you want to be a proper paper? Proper papers there. So I think there were discussions, and there would be disagreements about, whether we were overly sympathetic to this line. And I think probably some of us, I was probably guilty of this myself, if we were involved as well outside the paper in our own campaigns or issues or things that our own interests, we'd be trying to shove stuff in the paper all the time about those, and other people probably think a bit too much of this, you're always going to kind of have that. But it was a cooperative, and there was cooperative spirit. We didn't very often have meetings to say, what is our line on this? What is our discussion on this? I mean, I can remember we had one, I seem to remember it was in the pack horse up by the university rather than one of the other pack horses, about our coverage of feminism. There were different opinions about that. That was unusual in that we had a topic and different viewpoints on it. I don't know if Gordon or Julie.
Can I just say, sorry, because this is fantastic, but literally the alarms will be set in this building at 7:30, so we do have to go.
Okay. Well, are there any great insights that I've missed out about Wales?
Again, it's just to add that
You've got 1 minute.
okay, when we were starting Leeds Other Paper, and it was a kind of continuum from the previous one, because a lot of us, quite a few of us, have worked on the previous one, and we're so fed up about its demise all of a sudden, which came out of the blue, that we had to that we decided we wanted another one. But I, a few months ago, donated the papers of our meetings in the run-up to the other library. And when I looked at them, they were really quite tedious. It was how many angels could dance on a pinhead, for instance. We argued incessantly about the name. Was it going to be called Leeds Sludge or something else, or something else completely bizarre? And so, but behind that, there was this background consensus that we would say we're all on the same page, as we would say today, right?
Yeah. Background consensus.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's a good.
Thank you for
word
that.
to know.
Thank you. Just thank you so much for that. Really enjoyed that. Lots of feedback. Just a reminder, next month's talk is by Stephen Burt, and it is on Zoom only. That's part 2 of his Oates family story. Thank you.
So, yeah. We were not there to make money. We were there to support people in struggle through proper journalism, reporting what they were involved in. Knocking again. Okay.